What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you interviews with a whole host of scholars. And today on the podcast, returning, is the one and only Dr. Stephen G. Ray Jr. That's right, president of Chicago Theological Seminary and president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. He is back on the podcast, a special request by a number of members in the Homebrewed community. In this conversation, we have a whole bunch of fun. And let's be upfront, Stephen Ray is a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist, and I'm not at all. And yet, there was something about the passion, the prophetic vision, the theological sophistication in his articulation of his own account of the Reformed or Calvinist tradition that is a little bit alluring. But you'll hear that for yourself in just a minute. Before we hop into this episode, I just want to give a shout out to all the Homebrewed Christianity members. That's right. Not only do they tell me, Trip, bring back on cool people like Dr. Ray, who you've had on before, we want to hear from them again, but they are a part of a private Facebook group. They get the secret members-only podcast feed. And in it, you get access to hundreds of extra episodes, including classes that we do, special lectures, fun live events, all sorts of good stuff. And you can go check it out right now at homebrewedcommunity.com. Coming out this week is the first of a series of fun interactions on different philosophers. And we have a special guest lecture on Paul Ricoeur. That's right. Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher who came up with that whole image of a first naivete of faith, going through the desert of criticism and coming back to a second naivete. That guy, that image has been used a lot. Well, Dan Stiver, who helped start the Society for the Study of Paul Ricoeur, is joining the Homebrewed community to introduce Ricoeur's work, his life, trajectory of thought, and such. And then he'll be coming back to hang out with us live to explore a particular text of Ricoeur's, but also answer questions and engage in conversation with the Homebrewed members. So, go to homebrewedcommunity.com and be on the lookout for a little live, fun interaction. Alrighty. That said, buckle your theological safety belts, because Stephen Ray is back on the podcast. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is a legend, and so popular, a number of you said, when is Dr. Ray coming back on? So guess what? He's here from Chicago Theological Seminary. Stephen Ray, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Well, thank you. So glad to be here and just have a chance to talk with you again. So thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, and if you've joined the podcast since last time he was on, he is part of a group that put together the best constructive theology text, Awake to the Moment, and we'd spend quite a bit of time talking about that. But because the last conversation was so centered around the release of a whole bunch of theologians working to write a textbook to think about theology for this very moment, we didn't get to hear just the story and all the influences, questions, and struggles and doubts that led to Stephen Ray, the theologian. So when you think of where you are now and then look back to those early moments in your life, what's the story or two that pops to your mind where you go, I could end up a super nerd and a passionate articulator of the faith I'm inheriting?
Well, I think that the first story, and this is the one that really is when I got on the path of being a theologian as a profession. And that was, I was in my second semester of systematic theology and David Kelsey was giving a lecture about ecclesiology. And Tripp, I can't tell you I remember what he said, but all I could remember was that I was sitting in the back row and tears were just flowing down my face because I had never been engaged with thinking about the church at that level, or really the beauty of theology, that when it's done well, it has the capacity to touch your heart as well as your mind in ways that, and for me, when I saw the beauty of the thing, that was when I really began to think I really want to do this. And the second story, which was from my days in divinity school as well, was I was in a class with Serene Jones. And after class, I began talking with her about some ideas and some things that I was disagreeing with. And I think I probably was disagreeing with Carl Rahner about something. And she said, well, you should write a book about it. And the idea of writing a book on theology was just such a boon to me that those two moments are what put me on the path that really led me to become a theologian in an academic sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, David Kelsey's story and a Serene Jones story are both like high quality moments to point back to. When you, as someone who's a president of a seminary, and gets to be a part both as a theology professor, but also dealing with the students when they come to your office and go, what exactly did I sign up for when I showed up here? And people are getting shocked and wrestling and questioning whether or not the kind of faith that encouraged and sent them into the theological vocational wrestling of divinity school is really right for them. Like, what is some of the wisdom that you think we should attend to when we're asking those questions around vocation and questions, doubts, struggles, and what it means to be a leader and take ownership of our faith in the present?
Well, I think the first question, which is the one that I think is most important, is the question of how do I make sense of the world that I live in, which means the world as it is, and make sense of that in light of the way that I'm beginning to learn about theology. So, for instance, one of the things that really profoundly shaped my teaching was when I really began to recognize that when we begin to talk about creation, for instance, one of the things that we do is that we make the presumption, and this is actually contrary to the text itself, but the tradition has led us to actually begin to talk about creation as if it is creation that is related to what was God's intention. So what that means then is that one of the deep inner conflicts that many students have is when we begin to talk about the goodness of creation, when we begin to talk about any number of things, what can end up happening is that it bears no resemblance at all to the world in which people live in. And as a consequence, what that means is that people either develop heuristic devices, ways of translating the world as they know it to exist into the world of Christian theology, which is really largely an imaginative world that, depending on who you're reading, is some conjuring of nostalgia. Or what ends up happening is that they end up walking away thinking that, this is really okay, but it's not helping me think about the world in which I live in. And that's when you have so many people who come back and ask the question, well, did you prepare me for ministry? Did you prepare me for work in the world? Did you prepare me to do work in a nonprofit, community organizing, what have you? Because the tools, language, etc., are so attractive and so seductive that we can spend our time in the midst of them without building meaningful bridges for the world in which we live. So the way that changed teaching theology for me is I teach a very simple formulation, which is that, yes, this is the world that God created, Yeah, or rather, yes, God did create the world. There's a theological statement. But as we see in the book of Genesis, the world in which we live is not that world, right? And I mean, so when we talk about the grappling with Paul and sin, etc., that's what helps us understand that we need to create mediating structures and mediating languages for people to meaningfully begin to apply what they're learning and how they're being shaped as people who are thinking theologically in a world which, in and of itself, gives little evidence of God's love and God's care.
Mm-hmm. So I think part of that, part of creating that space theologically is it actually allows people to acknowledge and bring some of their own experiences into the theological classroom.
Yes.
Because if you think to do theology, right, is to already have sanitized your experience so it fits on the terms of, God's good world packed full of holy and glory goodness or whatever, then you've left so much aside. Like how do you describe, or how do you give the invitation for people of faith to acknowledge the fullness of their experience, the beauty and the pain, the joy and the grief and things, and then start to speak theologically?
Well, and that's where I think, affinity for Tillich comes in, is that I begin, first of all, with the questions that they raise. So whenever I talk about beginning with the questions that they raise, the biggest question that I find, and I found when I was teaching, is, first of all, how do I make sense of the text and the faith in light of my existence? Because if I can get some kind of mediating structure, then I can bring my existence to the table. Because if I'm presuming that what it is that I have to learn the tradition, I have to learn the doctrines, I have to learn the different ways of thinking about it, many times that doesn't leave room for us to bring our experience to the table. So, for instance, one book that I use in every class that I teach is Jesus and the Disinherited. And what that book does is it gives a way of translating lived human experience into the engagement with the text, which then gives people permission to do the same thing. Because I can give them permission, but if they don't know what it looks like, right? If they don't know what a deep engagement looks like, then they're still left wondering, well, how does it become more than simply a testimony service at the beginning of a worship service? How does it become more than what I see happening on TBN or some religious program? How does it become something deeper? And I think by giving them a model of what it looks like to actually engage lived existence. And here's the key, the thing about Jesus and the Disinherited is that it gives a picture of humanity at its worst, and it also gives a picture of humanity at its best. So there is a way that then creates a broad opening for people and gives them a permission structure for bringing whatever their experience is.
I think Jesus and the Disinherited is such a powerful book, and it's short enough. Most your students are going to finish it. Unlike if
Yes.
you handed them Tillich's 3-volume systematic and said, "I promise you, it's worth it." Right? It's like it. But one of the things about Thurman's work is that the questions that he's bringing to the gospel, right, in this kind of correlative act, are in some sense historically distant, but they're becoming questions more and more people are bringing.
Mm-hmm.
Like even in Scotland and teaching with students who are predominantly not even American, in the last 2 years, the number of people who are recognizing the way in which Western colonialism and imperialism has an inheritance that is been under-examined for lots of wrong reasons, and now more and more people are starting to acknowledge them. Like how does someone like Howard Thurman become an ally, an encourager, a prodder, or even a challenger to those who are or becoming more awakened to the present moment in the way these structural and systemic issues have a growing and an ever-present legacy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the way he becomes the conversation partner is by precisely the way he structures the book, right? Is that he helps give you a hermeneutic or, a way of interpreting the text that is anchored immediately in the lived experiences of people without going into the kind of language or the kind of framings that first you have to learn hermeneutics. Then we can begin to talk about how you apply them. Then we can begin to talk about how the text, he just tells a story. And he tells the story, and why I find it such a good teaching tool, particularly in seminary, is that he is using the best of mid 20th century biblical criticism, as well as what was emerging as psychological approaches to people in terms of psychology and religion, as well as doing sociology, as well as engaging history. So he's doing interdisciplinary work even before it had a name. And he's doing it in a way that becomes demonstrative, so that then as he migrates through the text, people can become engaged, certainly in talking about issues of race, et cetera, in America in the 20th century. But the point is that the lens that you're viewing it through now is one that has invited you to richly and deeply theologically think about it. And I mean, because when you look at how he unfolds, particularly the section of the book, Jesus and Interpretation, I mean, there is no better introduction for what hermeneutics looks like in the 20th century than that piece there, yet he uses none of the language. Right? He doesn't refer to any of the particular scholars, but he just does the work. So that then allows us, I think, in the classroom, but also in the school in general, once students have seen what it looks like when it's done, then we can step back and look at the mechanics of the thing, as opposed to beginning with the mechanics and then beginning to try to imagine what the finished product is going to look like. So, for instance, it's the difference between reading Dynamics of Faith, in which you get the entirety of the 3 volumes of the systematic theology, or beginning with the systematic theology. Because if you begin with Dynamics, then once you get to the actual systematics, that's light stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important, because a lot of times those of us that love theology enough to decide to do it professionally, we're the ones that are like, when can a student ask me to do an independent study on the systematics? And then we think we're trying to impart the same kind of love we have for the discipline, when, what you're saying that strikes me is that Jesus and the Disinherited, for example, is a text that's easier to finish, and yet he doesn't beat you over the head with the way he's included interdisciplinary conversations, the way he operates with a hermeneutical lens to show you just how the very message, meaning what Jesus said, did, and endured, put in the context of social structures of sin and disinheritance, it remains vibrant in our current context. Like, you read that and then you're like, oh, junk, this gospel is good news for the day. Mm-hmm. And then you say, yeah, and here's how the nerd works it. Where do you begin? And no one would suggest starting with the systematic text on the first date, but for some reason a lot of theologians think that's the way to pass on the tradition.
Mm-hmm. That's the way that I learned it. We ended up getting to. In fact, we didn't get into it in systematic theology. I got into it in another class, but certainly when I was teaching full time, that was always the introduction to Tillich, because once you understood that and got into his world, then we could begin to look at, and we could actually begin to help make him an interlocutor with other people that we wanted to learn about.
Well, so last time you were on, and a number of people kept requesting for you to come back, and there were a number of topics people sent in that said, "I want to know what Dr. Ray thinks now," or "Here's a follow-up question," and you might could give some background in case people didn't listen before. But you've written one of my favorite books, "Do No Harm." It's about social sin, Christian responsibility, and we discussed it last time. And one of the questioners said, it seemed like Dr. Ray dialed back the intensity that if after Trump and everything, he might want to be a bit more clear. That it seemed like he was being tame and looking at the continued inheritance of white supremacy shaping the church. And I recently, when Adam Clark was on the podcast, we had a similar conversation where it's one of these moments, and he said something along the lines of, "I have a lot of friends that are trying to decide, like how you pitch talking about structural sin when people that are your friends, people care about you, or that have been so embedded in white supremacy, are waking up more and more to it." And there are a number of questions around this. So maybe you could share a bit about how you understand structural sin, and then how, as a leader in the church, in the theological academy, do you help people at different places that are going like, "We've known this for a long time. Why are people finally waking up?" to someone who's like just starting to acknowledge it? How do you negotiate that as a theologian, a prophet, but also a minister is trying to bring people along and have us all work together towards something beautiful?
Well, Trent, one of the things that I discovered, I think, over the last decade, really, in terms of thinking about it, is that the biggest problem with trying to help people understand and navigate structural systems of evil, particularly that manifest themselves as white supremacy, does not have as much to do with helping them see their complicity. But, and this was really a breakthrough for me, understanding that the problem is not them. The problem is the people that they love that willingly perform acts that sustain structural evil, willingly perform actions that contribute to the workings of white supremacy. Because, often when we talk about it as if it is personal guilt, right? Is that helping? But, what I found is that in terms of what becomes the greatest barrier, it's not simply one claiming one's personal guilt, because there's a way that we can bring to bear categories like fallenness, we can bring to bear categories like original sin that we can take upon ourselves. But it becomes much more difficult to make moral judgments about those whom we love. And what I mean about those whom we love is that, and this is going to sound like a simple statement that almost doesn't need to be said, but virtually every white person comes from a family of white people. So what that means is that when we begin to interrogate whiteness, it's not just about the person. It's about the people that they love. So how do you make sense of? And, you can write them off, but you can't write off the people who made you. You can't write off the people who shaped you. Unless they do something that is terribly abominable, because then we can say, well, they've crossed the line. But if they just live everyday lives as participants in systems that continue to reinscribe the structures of white supremacy in ways that diminish the lives of Black and brown people, then what ends up happening is that they've not done anything heinous, but what they've done is the most necessary act of systemic evil, which is making it quotidian and everyday. And that becomes the piece. Well, how do we make sense of that? Because it's one thing to become convicted yourself, but it's quite another thing to do as Jesus suggested: put your hand back on the plow and turn your back on your family and move, because that then in and of itself seems as if it's a moral evil. But I think at root, and this is not part of what you asked, but I'll put it out there because I think this is related as well, is that there is within the Christian imagination as it exists in the United States, but I think largely in the Western world, nothing that a person can do to a Black person. So it's not just white people, but anyone can do to a Black person that has any salvific consequence. Now, what I mean by that is that there's nothing that you can do to a Black person, to a brown person, in the mindset of most of Christian America, that will damn you to hell forevermore. Right now, so what that means then is that if there's nothing that you can do that is of salvific consequence, then at the end of the day, these people like me, are eschatologically inconsequential to God. And if we are inconsequential to God, then what that means is that, number one, how it is that you comport yourself toward us is always a theologically secondary nature. But then number two, there are ways in which our familial connections will always supersede our obligation to people who are eschatologically or salvifically, that's a better word for it, salvifically inconsequential.
Wow. Okay. Like you said, two things that are extremely profound. In the first part that I just want to raise up and maybe as a brief follow-up is that, for a lot of people who, you gave most white people have white family, right? So, but even if they don't do the heinous act, they do the most necessary part. And I think I know what you mean, having spent time processing it and thinking about it. But for those that may not get the weight of it and get for someone who grew up in the South and half my family thinks I'm crazy, I really know, like when you said that, I get it. And just the other day, I was talking to my son, who's 13, who grew up in Los Angeles and then was back in the South before he came to Scotland, and was like, this place is weird, Dad. Like, why would people act like this? And because he didn't grow up in the South, a lot of the just naturalized racist things, like I moved back there and I just like, this is how things are and I don't notice it. And he calls it out. And I'm like, I'd never thought about it that way. I'd never seen it this way. Right. Like even to students in a class walking by a monument to the Civil War that says "For our Confederate dead" on it with cannons pointing out in downtown Raleigh. Right. Like he's the one that starts crying and goes, why would they have those pointed out towards school kids going to see stuff? Half those people, that's not their dead, And I'd walked by that monument the whole time growing up and not thought about it. But and that was one of those times where I go like, oh my God, like I think there's so many places we don't even know what we need to repent for because we're so stuck. Right. And then there's that most necessary part where we're always like, trying to deal with the few things we can manage to see at this moment. And then you're like, it's difficult because I have so many family and friends. They're stuck in this. Just to even be faithful for what I see, let alone the things I don't see yet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that line you said that we do the most necessary part. Like, can you describe that, like, structurally, and like, in what ways can that shape our theological imagination so that we aren't always managing our guilt so we get to sleep good in a system where we're still performing the necessary?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you just said it in the way you formulated it, right? Is that once we become obsessed with our guilt and don't simply receive it as a given, and then we begin to ask, well, the guilt is connected to the privilege that comes from a system, right? Because that's what the guilt is about. That's what we feel. That's what we know. And the more we see, the more we're able to see the unearned privilege that we have and the unearned disadvantage that others have. And our guilt is related to that. But if we and this is why I find the doctrine of original sin so powerful in terms of using that in an analogical way. If we simply accept that it's a given that becomes inescapable, right? Because the thing about it is that, and this is the one thing that it really takes a lot of people to learn about living in racist systems, is that no one has a decision about what they are going to be. Right. I mean, you may decide that, oh, I'm not going to be white, but you don't have a decision because it's the way the world sees you and treats you. I can decide, like Sidney Poitier in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, when he told his father, you know, you think of yourself as a colored man, I think of myself as a man. Well, that's fine, but the world doesn't think of you as a man. It thinks of you as a colored man. So what that means is that the critical term is to say, I will always carry this guilt because the privilege from which it comes is attributed to me and becomes inescapable. The question is, what am I going to do with that privilege? What am I going to do with what has been given to me? And while it's creating continual guilt, and I should feel the guilt because that then is what helps me keep asking, well, what can I do about it? Because it doesn't become escapable. You can't work your way out of it, right? I mean, that's the whole way Augustine talks about original sin. You can't work your way out of it. You can't save yourself. But what you can do is that you can identify the ways that sin is working in your life and ways that you can use its workings to actually bring more glory to God, or in the case that we're talking about now, undermining systems of white supremacy and oppression. Because at the end of the day, guilt is unproductive. But if you are an Arminian, and that's why I continually tell people I'm a Calvinist, if you are an Arminian, the guilt can lead to a self-obsession because you believe that you actually can participate in a more than meaningful way in your own salvation. And so I'm not meaning to, as it were, cast aspersions, because there are many very good Armenians who I love and who are very dear to my heart. But I think, honestly, Trip, that's the key, is that the guilt, once it's received as something that is inescapable, you have to ask then what occasions the guilt, and it's the unearned privilege that disadvantages others. And once you can understand that, then you can ask, what am I going to do with this privilege? Because I didn't do anything to earn it. I didn't ask for it, but it was the system of iniquity that ascribed it to me. So now that I have it, what am I going to do with it? Because if I don't do anything with it, then I've actually just propped the system up a little bit more, because it means that it's been able to write a check that will never be cashed.
That is one of the most, I think, powerful ways of inheriting the Reformed tradition. Schleiermacher has that line where he talks about the problem with a higher anthropology is it's easy for one's sin to set one against another because you're assessing righteousness rather than one's an understanding of depravity that means that it sets one for another, right? Because we're differently stricken with the same affliction, and so you're not trying to like differentiate yourself by righteousness, but differentiate yourself in the move towards the other. It's now, as someone who went to Claremont and as a process person, these are the few moments, where you say to yourself, well, they got a point to make there. I just I don't, but the other line you said just a minute ago where you were talking about I'll say it differently just because I wrote down, eschatologically inconsequential, but in a sense it's that, if our ultimate identity and status before God, as both the oppressor and the oppressed is under the erasure of a flattening and then in this sense deflating account of the gospel, one where justice and injustice are evacuated, then the how do you square that with Jesus and the disinherited, or Moses saying, "Let my people go," or any of the times that the very location God declares who God is are in those spaces where God takes sides, and it's real easy to go like, yeah, that's obvious, if you pay attention to scripture. But what do you think it is about the church in our present situation where so many different elements of it are just uncomfortable with naming the kind of preferential place in which the revelation of God comes, or the way in which divine solidarity shows up? That we're just uncomfortable without that kind of deflated, vapid, universal, lovey-huggy divine blanket being thrown over everything.
Well, I think a couple of things. One is that along with the presumption that Black and Brown people are salvifically inconsequential, is the other piece that white people are ultimately consequential, salvifically. So that is the simple presumption. So what that means then is that if that's the simple presumption, that shapes the way in which one reads the text, the way in what one sees the symbols of the Christian faith, and the way in which one reads the tradition. So, for instance, one of the things that it becomes very difficult for people to wrap their minds around is that a couple of things. One is that Calvin, in our tradition, Reformed tradition, Calvin wasn't a white guy, right? He would have no idea what you were talking about because the identity of whiteness had not evolved yet. But there's a way in which he is read as the quintessential white guy. So that what ends up happening is that when he talks about election, that becomes a proxy for talking about whiteness, right? And that becomes a baseline assumption that is never named because it's something that is just always assumed. And so as a consequence, then, when we come to the question of reading the text, the underlying assumption will always be the bedrock of the text. So even when you're looking at the text, and this is a distinction that I used to draw in class, you can look at the text and not actually be seeing what is on the page, right? Because you're reading the words, but you already have the superstructure of meaning in your mind. So no matter what the words say, they simply sort of go into one of the slots in that superstructure. So that becomes a critical piece And what the challenge becomes at that point is, how do you first name the presumption? But then number two, how do you exercise the presumption, right? Because what's required is a kind of exorcism. So because then you can find, how do you create a Damascus Road experience so that people actually can get to a place where they can actually see what's on the page and not sort of have what's already in their mind sort of rearrange the meaning that's on the page and rearrange the meaning that is coming from the text. Because as you said, there is no one who can read the text and come away with the presumption that God was on the side of the Egyptians, the Assyrians, or the Romans. Certainly God uses them as with everything else, but God was never on their side. But we routinely read the text in support of white supremacy as if God consistently was on the side of the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Romans.
Oh, I definitely think that's I definitely think that's the case. And one of the other questions that a listener sent in was, it, I grew up in a very white evangelical context, and after Trump was elected, I had trouble showing back up at church, and then after the previous election, I just am uncomfortable using the term evangelical again, and yet I have a deep love for Scripture, but having trouble finding a place in a community that resonates with my passion for justice and my love for Christ at the same time. Like, and I know in a lot of people that are in theological education, this is like you end up meeting students, especially ones that come out of an evangelical context, and then they find someplace like Chicago Theological Seminary. It's connected to the UCC. I know my wife and I are both ordained Baptists, and we have spent 15 years working at UCC congregations before we came to Scotland, because we weren't working at a church that wasn't committed to our deep passion for God's justice in the world. So I feel like there are a lot of people who want to say no, right, to that, the 81% of white evangelicalism that can't even tolerate imagining a different picture. So, like, what kind of advice or wisdom or guide would you give to those who do have that past and are trying to find a new space? And what kind of advice, as someone who's facilitated meeting them, would you give for those that are like, why did it take so long? You're just now figuring this stuff out. Like, as someone who mediates at a community that brings so many of those people together, do you have wisdom for us so maybe the church can find more allies and benefit from the wisdom of those who were seeing the signs of the times earlier?
Well, I think, let me say two things, but let me say one thing first, is that just in terms of the work of theology, we need some people to begin to do some historical recovery of the debate over slavery. And here's why I say this, is because the debate over slavery was a debate between evangelicals. I mean, that's what it was about. There have been a number of historians who've written about that, but there haven't been any theologians who've taken it seriously, historical theologians, because I think that what ends up happening is that if we are reminded that that was a debate between evangelicals, it makes room to legitimate someone reconstructing the identity of evangelical as an abolitionist, right? And I think that one of the things in our time is that there was a significant amount of language that's going on, particularly within the activist movement, as well as in many social justice movements, around the idea of abolition. So if there was a way that someone could creatively, and when I say creatively, I mean tell the story as it actually was, but do so in a way that it has current application so that one can point very clearly to the abolitionists of that age who we know were on the side of the angels, if you want to use the language, they can become an archetype for people who today want to, because they've been shaped and formed by this tradition, begin to articulate it in a different way and begin to articulate it in a forceful kind of way. Because, what I equate that to is that certainly within our own tradition, even though it may seem as if it was a very late development. I mean, when I was beginning to do my work in the early to mid 90s, and I was beginning, to do some speaking around, write articles here and there, the idea that I would actually willingly and publicly proclaim myself as a Black Calvinist was just like unfathomable to very many people in the theological world and in the groups in which I worked, the work group on constructive theology. When I said I was a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist, which I continue to say even until today, it was because of the frame with which they were working of what Calvinism meant. There was a way in which my interpretation of it, both in terms of my work embodiment, as well as just the way that I moved through the world, created a space to think about Calvinism as such, and to think about the Reformed tradition for very many people in ways that was generative, in ways that they couldn't have imagined. So, I mean, I just want to say that someone needs to do that work. Now, to your other question, I think one of the pieces that becomes critically important as well, and this is what comes from our own tradition, which is that there is always a necessity for theological humility, right? And the theological humility that comes from the fact that because we understand ourselves, along with everyone else, to be trapped by these structures of sin, we are very clear that there are ways in which we are participating, no matter how woke we are, in the maintenance of these systems that are unapparent to us, that we have to move through the world with humility. And it's that humility that allows us to be welcoming of those who come from other spaces, because they actually become, at least for me, a material manifestation of the power of the Spirit, because it then shows me that this work is not in vain, right? Because if no one was ever converted, if the scales never fell from anyone's eyes, if no one ever believed that there had to be a way that you could love Jesus and not be someone who was a part of actively oppressing others. If there are people who come with that, then that is the material demonstration that the work that we do is worth it, that the Spirit is actually doing some work. So far from, looking and saying, well, what took you so long? Or, glad you finally got here. Look at it as, this is an opportunity that the Spirit, in the midst of all of the setbacks, in the midst of, so for instance, for me, one of the things, and this is why I was much more politically strident in 2016 than I had been in many, many years, because I understood that the election of Donald Trump was a signal defeat of the work that my generation had done for at least 20, perhaps 30 years, on behalf of creating a more just society, because the structures of white supremacy and oppression are still very strong and very active, that all it would take would be one person like him to unleash political and social forces with which I will be dealing with for the rest of my life. And so a part of then that activism and connecting it to your question is that it could have led me to lose hope, because it could have led me to say, we've been defeated. And I mean, I don't know if you were following me on Facebook at the time, but one of the things I continually said was, don't sugarcoat what we have just lost. Don't sugarcoat it. We've lost a battle that is going to take us several decades to get back what we've lost. And if I don't have the material manifestation that the Spirit really is working to make things better, that the Spirit really is helping people to have a Damascus Road experience. If I don't have then first of all, I can't have any faith that the Spirit is going to help me in the places that I can't see. But number two, I'm going to raise the question, why am I doing this at all? So my daughter, when she was younger, would always tell me, she said, you are a very bright man. You went to Yale, you graduated with a master's degree in summa cum laude. You got a PhD from Yale University. You could have used that same brain power and gone to Yale Law School. And do you know how much better my life would have been if you had made that choice? So we had that conversation a few times. But the point is that what is it that makes that sacrifice? To have pursued theology as the love of my life, as opposed to a degree from Yale Law School or some others. You see what I'm getting at? So then when we see our siblings who come to Chicago Theological Seminary and they find a place of welcome, or when I was at Garrett, it was much the same way, although not exactly the same because their politics are a bit different in the UMC. But to be able to see people come and find welcome, but more importantly, to explore and discover the way that they can make sense of how they've been shaped in terms of their love of Scripture, their personal relationship with Jesus, and begin to translate that into a meaningful sort of identity that can move through the world in ways that promote justice, that becomes a point of celebration and not a point of smugness, to be able to say, well, we're glad you're here.
Oh, I can see why you're in charge of a seminary. Like, even when you give that example, I just think of how difficult it was for Peter to realize the Spirit was on Paul's side when it goes to the Gentile question, right? Like, where then everyone's like, no, the same Spirit that's within us is in them. And I just hope that, we're moving towards one of those moments where you've just had so much of the church being lethargic and not attentive to what God's up to, that as they become attentive, you have people that are more passionate and more powerful and can grow it in ways that the rest of us that have been sitting there staring at our clocks have to get called out to join something so big and new that that we wouldn't have even put it on our agenda. That's a real beautiful challenge. Like, one of the things that that I want, like, when you mentioned your Facebook. So if people aren't following you on Facebook, it's easy to follow someone, and following like brilliant theologians that actually say what they're thinking day to day is always like a high quality maneuver. So they should all Go follow your Facebook feed. But one of the things that it even has always struck me about your clarity is how when I'll read something like, yeah, I don't know, I probably have to dial that back. Like I've like ingrained being the white minister at a UCC church that's very large in Southern California, and I already know I edit. You know what I mean? Like it was the biggest UCC church in LA, and I was the token straight guy on staff, and I still knew I was going to edit and not say everything I thought. It's so like when I start to see other people that just don't do it, and they edit and they like share it, and then like will wrestle and even change their mind and stuff in public, I always think to myself, there's something that's getting itself done in the way we see leadership, that we somehow think leadership isn't telling the truth all the time. It's being selective. And then there's a different type of leadership when you come to trust your encounter and vision that you've had, and the vision that you're giving yourself to in the light of Christ, and can speak it strongly and clearly. Like for people, there are thousands of ministers that listen to this podcast. Like, do you have advice on like how you decide to pitch and when you decide to be clear on particular issues like that? Like other than like, I'm real clear about my preferential option for the Lakers, and I'm currently sad about it.
Well, I think that for me, what it comes from a confidence that number one, I am an interpreter of the tradition from which I come. And see, I think that there is a way in which, and this is particularly the case in the UCC, I think, in many ways, that the sort of derision of tradition has been such that being an embodiment of the tradition is something that many people, particularly clergy folk, sort of don't embrace fully, because in their minds, and I think rightly so, they look at the sins of the tradition and they don't want to embody that. Right. But see, here again, if we go back to, and this is where original sin helps us again, is that if you go back and say that we are a part of the tradition, whether we like it or not, the ways that we use language, the text that we use, the way we perform our faith. So the question is, are we going to pretend that we are not bearers of the tradition, in which case we leave it wholly to others, and usually others who will use it in very harmful ways to very publicly be interpreters of it? Or do we claim that, but we claim that in a way that the tradition is brought to the service of a vision of wholeness and flourishing? So, I mean, people think it's just a personality quirk or something like that when I continue to tell people I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist. I do that for a very strategic reason, because if I claim the role of being a legitimate interpreter of the tradition, then there is a way that I bring a confidence into when I talk about things that I can't have if I'm just on my own. Right? If I'm just on my own, and this is the way that I feel about things, and there are a lot of people who feel the same way that I do. There are a lot of people who are engaged in the social justice work the way that I am. Trip, the social justice work has a lineage of about a minute or maybe 10 seconds in human history, but the Christian tradition as a fund for people doing that work has at least a millennia and a half, if not 2 and more millennia. And there's a certain confidence, I think, that comes when you feel that you are giving something more than your own. And I'm not saying you're doing a whole lot more than that, but one of the ways that I mean by that is that you have to learn about the tradition as well, and spend some time becoming deepening in it. Because if worse comes to worse, if I get into an argument with someone, I can quote the Institute's chapter and verse. I can sort of move through all these texts. But the point is, however you gain it, the key is to have confidence that you are not standing alone, because you self-edit when you feel like you're standing alone, right? You sort of hold back when you feel like you're standing alone. But if you have a deep sense that you are standing in the deep wells of the tradition, as you are casting a vision of a more just world, of a world in which there's flourishing for all, first of all, it's tremendously empowering. But I think also it has a power because you are inviting people into something larger than themselves. One of the things that certainly many writers and social theorists, et cetera, identified in the mid 20th century when they were talking about the super self, et cetera, is that the key to any social movement is the ability for you to help people feel as if they belong to, not that they're part of, but they actually belong to something larger than themselves. And I mean that this is what Calvin's, I think, whole pneumatology was about, right? Is Calvin's whole pneumatology is that the Spirit isn't just at work in the world. It is at work, but it's at work doing something very particular. And the very particular thing that it is doing is joining you to the trans-historical, trans-geographic person of Jesus, so that you are never alone, but you are actually a part of the life of Christ as it is unfolding in the world, right? You're not witnessing it, you're not seeing it happen over here, but you are actually a part of it. And that's the key. And I think then, for those who find themselves in pastoral capacities and those who find themselves in leadership capacities, is that if you have the confidence that you are not alone, because you stand strongly within a tradition, but you stand in it in a way that exemplifies the best of the tradition and not simply the ways that it has been used, then you can invite others to have that same confidence. And that's what becomes a transformative experience.
Oh, that's really well put. And the image that pops in my head is something like, if you're acting, as an automaton, like it detached from the tradition, then you feel the burden to decide whether or not you're going to be prophetic. But if you dig your roots deep in your tradition, then all you have to do is be its scribe in the moment, and you'll speak with more gusto than if you're bearing the mantle all alone.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh man. All right. Like, now I feel like I just have to have theological counseling with you on a regular basis. This is too rewarding. All right, so two more questions. These are sent from ministers. One is from a friend of mine. He's from North Carolina, and he is a minister at a Black missionary Baptist church, mm-hmm. and he said, after all the George Floyd protests, I finally connected with a whole bunch of white mainline Protestants. I don't understand what they're talking about half the time. I'm glad they showed up. Like, if I was trying to figure out how to connect what it is they're doing to a prophetic missionary Baptist gospel on the corner, how would I figure it out?
Well, I think the thing that might help him is that two things. Number one, liberal white Christianity, and this goes back to a point we talked about earlier, already presumes their salvation. And they don't presume their salvation because of any particular sort of doctrine of providence or any particular doctrine of elect. No, I mean some of them talk about that, most of them don't. They simply presume it because of that dynamic we were talking about a little bit earlier. So what that means then is that missionary Baptists very much do not presume that, right? Missionary Baptists very much presume that souls are saved, right? That there's not this general kind of presumption of salvation. So in terms of thinking that, those are the different kinds of architectures of thought. So, he doesn't have to agree with them to know this is where they're coming from. So what ends up happening is that as they're doing the work and is that they're doing good stuff, first of all, salvation doesn't have anything to do with it. Whereas with the missionary Baptists, there is a way in which the work, once you finally get folk involved with it, it becomes very much wrapped up in their salvation. And so just recognizing that as best as they can, these folk are working out their salvation because they've already presumed it. But the analog is that you are working toward your salvation. So salvation then becomes the mediating structure for thinking about it and thinking about particularly white liberal Christians that are doing this and that are showing up again and again and again and again, right? Whether they say the words or not, it's because they're working out their presumed salvation. So it's all salvific work. And if you can view them as being partners in this salvific work, then you don't have to agree with how they think about salvation, but you're both involved in salvific work.
Oh, that's helpful. All right. So the last question, there are two different people asked it in different ways, but given all the things that are going on, where who knows how functional American democracy is going to be, the way the economy is going to change after COVID and everything else that's been dealing with it, and the way it's impacting, all the generations after the boomers and what their horizon structures are for possibilities, the growing income gap. There are so many things before you throw on the ecological crisis.
Right.
And there are two different people, and this has come up on a number of podcasts. Like, if you're thinking about the vocation of the church, if you're thinking about ecclesiology, and you go, what should we be preparing for now? What kind of questions should we be asking so the church can be the church after whatever big crisis is coming, where, you don't get a vaccine too quick, where you don't if this was the test case, are there things we should be learning from what's just happened so that the church is more attentive to its community and more prepared to be agents of blessing, transformation, justice in the next big eruption?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think two things. One is my own sense is I shy away from the territory of folk like Stanley Hauerwas and others who begin to try to think about the church as somehow being a leaven or somehow being in our own particularity, something that is able to be a saving force in the world apart from the world, because we're very much a part of the world. I think that to the extent that, and this is a very simple thing that, really circles back to almost where we began in the conversation, is to critically challenge, critically guide, and critically lead all of our membership to ask the simple question: what can I do with the privilege that I hold to help save the world? Because when we are talking about the church in North America, when we're talking about the audience that's listening to your podcast, we're talking about the people that are going through the halls of Chicago Theological Seminary. We're talking about some of the most privileged people in all of human history. So that may be mitigated by things like where I'm currently at financially. That may be mitigated by things like whether or not I'm queer. That may be mitigated by things like whether or not I'm a male or I'm Black. It may be mitigated, but the point still remains that we hold within our hands a level of human privilege and power that can change the face of this planet and its future and everyone on it if we stop being so self-obsessed with how it is that we can save ourselves through either the performance of what we think are good works or having the right mindset, being woke enough, if we can do the simple work of saying, and I mean, scripture there again, right? I mean, because the point of the story of the fishes and loaves is that Jesus asked people who actually had some food to give it to me and I will multiply it, right? We don't often think about that story in that way, but these were people who had food and all the other folk were hungry. So they had privilege and he took what privilege they had. And we can go through the beginning back in the book of Exodus, or even better, beginning back in the book of Genesis, right? I mean, one of the things that we see in the text in Genesis was of the many things Abraham was, a poor man was not one of them. No, so he ended up showing up in places where he may have been skirting on the margins, but he never became a poor man his entire life, right? When we look in Moses, right? When God calls Moses, God called this person who was on the run because of a crime that he did. But let us not forget, you don't grow up in Pharaoh's house and not know all of the customs of power. You don't grow up in Pharaoh's house without knowing exactly how to conjugate your verbs so that people will never mistake you for a field hand. Right? You don't grow up in Pharaoh's house without understanding the different ways that you can move resources and ask. Do you see the point I'm getting? And throughout the text, so the greatest thing we can do, I think, is number one, to help people begin to get past the guilt trip that we talked about a little bit earlier. Be clear about what power do I hold? What power do we hold? And so what that means is that no matter what happens within our society, we will still be one of the most powerful forces for good that is at work because of the reality that whether we want to name it or whether we want to claim it, the truth is that within our hands, we hold levels of privilege that have never been known in human history.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, I have so enjoyed and feel challenged by so much that you shared. It's been a real privilege to get to talk to you again. Is there anything that that you have that you want to share that I didn't ask the right question for you to get to, or do you want to say a bit about the school and way in particular, like parts of church life that Chicago Theological Seminary is training people for, so that if someone's interested, they know how to reach out?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the biggest thing, and certainly you can find us, just do a Google of Chicago Theological Seminary, and that will take you right to our webpage. But I think the biggest thing that I would lift up is that we have significantly and substantially shaped the program and life of our school so that we have a significant and substantial interreligious reality. Now, here's what I mean by that, is that if we are going to save this world in which we live, and what I mean by save is that the world is going to be fine. The only question is whether or not the ecosystems that support our form of life will continue to exist. I mean, even if they don't exist, the world is going to be fine. But if we are going to win that battle, it's going to require the work of people of faith across a spectrum. So part of what we're dedicated to is providing the opportunity for people to stand in the integrity of their own faith, but learn how to be leaders with people of other faiths who are standing in the integrity of their own tradition. Because I don't have an interest in religious understanding. That's an important thing. A lot of people do that. That's not what we do. I don't have a particular interest in mission work. A lot of people do that. What I have an interest in, and we're shaping at the institution, is how does someone learn how to be a powerful, transformative leader, a Christian leader, and also come to that sort of understanding of oneself where a constituent part of it is that you can't imagine being such a leader without Muslim partners, without Jewish partners. So you can't imagine a world in which your work is complete unless you're able to have partners that complete your work as they complete their work and you complete their work. And I think that that's one of the things that we really are trying to make a signature difference, because at the end of the day, the piece about justice and mercy, which is our tagline, justice and mercy, that can't happen in a world if only some people are beneficiaries.
Yeah, that's great. And for those listening to the podcast, Jose Morales, who's been on the podcast before when we were both in school together at Claremont, is now on faculty.
Yes,
at CTS. So there's a whole nother reason to think about going, and you can always follow him on social media and get updates, because now the question is, do y'all have a competition about who knows how to rock the bow tie best? Because I think you both are very good looking in bow ties and know how to do it while theologizing with gusto.
Well, what I will say, because I want to make sure that we keep our good brotherly relations, is I'm not going to answer that question, but I will. But what I will say, though, is that he does rock the 1 and 2 and Mike as DJ Rayma much better than I ever could.
That's good. That's good. All right. We didn't need to start any hostility on faculty about level of dapperness when it comes to the bow tie. But
well, remember, we're still missionaries, because we still have a few people who wear long ties. So he and I are both still on our missionary journey.
There you go. There you go. My brother can wear a bow tie, but his neck's about 6 inches shorter than mine. I feel like whenever I wear one, it doesn't work out. I'm about 30 pounds from being able to wear a bow tie. I got in lockdown, not a helping on that. So
I understand.
But thank you so much. It's been a complete blast to get to talk to you again. And I don't know if there's a competition for coolest Calvinist, but if there is, I'm going to nominate you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Awesome.